Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 91 of the podcast. I am excited that you're here because this is a really special episode. You'll be hearing from Anne Cushman, who is truly a legend in the field of mindful yoga. She's someone that I've looked up to for a really long time, so it was amazing to get to chat with her here on the podcast. She shares some fascinating history and great stories as someone who really had a front row seat to the development of yoga and Buddhist Dharma culture in the West. You'll hear about her time working as an editor and writer at Yoga Journal, which was a pretty different publication back in those days, including her experience interviewing BKS Iyengar. She also shares what it was like being one of the first teachers to offer yoga practices on Buddhist meditation retreats at Spirit Rock Meditation Center. We talk about why it's been important for her to combine mindful movement and meditation on her path, and how yoga asana allowed her to fully embody Dharma teachings beyond a conceptual understanding. You'll hear how she defines mindful yoga and how cultivating awareness allows us to meet all of the contents of our experience on the mat and off. Just in case you're not familiar with Anne yet, here's a bit of her official bio. Anne Cushman is a pioneer in the integration of mindfulness, embodied meditation, and creative expression. A senior teacher at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, she founded the first multi-year Buddhist meditation training for yoga teachers. She's the author of the memoir, The Mama Sutra, A Story of Love, Loss, and the Path of Motherhood. The novel, Enlightenment for Idiots, honored by Booklist as one of the top 10 first novels of its year. The mindful yoga book, Moving into Meditation, and the India Pilgrimage Guide, From Here to Nirvana. And her essays on spiritual practice and daily life have appeared in the New York Times, Yoga Journal, the Oprah Magazine, Lion's Roar, Tricycle, and many other publications. She is a guiding teacher for the Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Certification Program, or MMTCP, which has trained thousands of teachers in more than 70 countries. She mentors mindfulness practitioners and writers worldwide and leads retreats and classes both in person and online, with a focus on creativity, embodiment, and connection with nature and daily life practice. We also chat about a new program she has coming up soon, a Dharma, Yoga, and Mindfulness training at Spirit Rock, which is a year-long certificate program that starts at the end of May 2024. So if you're listening to this in time, I highly recommend going to check that out. I did a similar training there about 10 years ago that we talk about in this episode, and it was a wonderful experience. Do be sure to check out this episode's podcast page on my website at movedtomeditate.yoga/podcast, so you can find all of the links and resources that we mention in this conversation. And if you enjoy this episode, please share it. You could post this episode on social media or send it to someone that you know would be really inspired by Anne. Another great way to spread the word is to give the show a review on Apple Podcasts or your player of choice, because those ratings really do help people to find us. Thanks so much for listening. Let's get into this insightful conversation with Anne Cushman. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. I am so honored to have Anne Cushman joining me on the podcast today. I read a bit more of her official bio in the intro you just heard, so I'll keep this shorter and just introduce her here by saying that I really consider her to be one of the absolute trailblazers in this field of embodied mindfulness. And she's a huge influence on my teaching because I got to spend a significant amount of time learning from Anne about 10 years ago. Can't believe it's been that long, but through the mindful yoga and meditation training at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, which has now evolved into a new Dharma yoga and mindfulness program that's coming up soon. So we'll have Anne tell us more about that in a bit. And Anne is also the author of one of my favorite books that I've recommended to so many of you, which is Moving into Meditation, a 12-week mindfulness program for yoga practitioners. And she's a novelist, she's a memoirist, she's a creative person. So I think we're just really in for an expansive and inspiring conversation today. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Anne.
Thank you, Addie. Really lovely to be here with you.
So, could we perhaps start kind of at the beginning of your practice and have you share with us a little bit about how you got started both in yoga and in meditation?
Yes, I began my journey back in the early 80s. And at the time I was an undergraduate, I was a sophomore at Princeton University. And I had signed up for a class called The Self and World Religions. And honestly, I signed up for it because it did not meet too early in the morning and because it got rave reviews in the student course guide. And I thought, oh, well, this could be an interesting thing to do. And I was immediately entranced. It had a wonderful professor, and the focus of the course was really looking at these questions which, at that age and stage of my life, were so vivid and foremost in my mind around meaning. What is it all about? Who am I really? What is the purpose of life? Those kind of big questions that you're hitting at that stage of life. And it was examining those questions through the lens of the world's great spiritual traditions. And so I was hooked, and I was especially captivated and intrigued by the teachings of Buddhism and yoga and Hinduism. So these great spiritual traditions arising from the Indian subcontinent. The philosophies which I was being exposed to made sense to me, and I wanted to learn more. And so I immediately decided to switch my major, and I became a religion major with a concentration in Hinduism and Buddhism. And then, of course, I quickly discovered that you couldn't get at the essence of these traditions simply from books and writing papers and taking exams. So I began seeking out teachers who would be able to help me get an experiential understanding of what this was all about.
Wow, how amazing that you sort of stumbled into this deep, calling and inquiry through a college course. I guess, some of
Yes.
us had that experience. It wasn't my experience. I think mine was more like college stressed me out to the point where I had to discover yoga. Not through a class, but as another activity outside of that. But that's wonderful. And you recognized that it wasn't just an academic pursuit, clearly. So, who were some of the teachers that you sought out and practiced with, and who became, influential on your path early on?
Well, I began in the Zen tradition simply because that was what was nearby. I was in New Jersey and there was a Zen center in New York, the Zen Center of New York. So I went there first and then out to California to the Zen Center of Los Angeles. And so really began in that tradition. Maizumi Roshi was the Roshi at the Zen Center of Los Angeles. And from there, let's see, maybe I'll do the Dharma thread first and then the yoga thread. In the Dharma thread, I began connecting in the late 80s with the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition and went to Plum Village and practiced with Thich Nhat Hanh. Also connected with the insight meditation tradition Jack Kornfield was teaching in a little church in Fairfax, north of San Francisco, even before Spirit Rock Meditation Center was founded. And so I began practicing there and going on retreats in that tradition. And meanwhile, I had connected with the yoga tradition because honestly, it really wasn't until I began practicing yoga, which was shortly after I graduated from college, that I really connected with that deeply, that I began to be able to embody and sense in a really embodied way what the Dharma traditions had been pointing me toward. So I connected with first, I was living in Santa Cruz. I connected with a teacher named Kali Ray, who was teaching a style of yoga called Tri Yoga, which was a very flowing vinyasa type practice, but was also rooted, as she was, in a spiritual tradition with a guru who she had studied with, an Indian guru. And so it did have these elements of not just asana and pranayama, but also chanting, devotional practices, meditative practices. And then from there, I began to explore the Iyengar tradition and trained a little bit at uh, did a little teacher training, maybe a year or two at the Iyengar Institute in San Francisco. And then also discovered the teachings of Angela Farmer, which were really kind of, she was a little bit of a rebel in the Iyengar tradition. And so really emphasizing the feminine, the creative, the intuitive, and the exploration and manifestation of the inner body. And she was
Mm.
profoundly influential for me. So those were some of my early roots back in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, it's just such an amazing array of different energies, from the structure of Zen and Iyengar, and then some of the looser and more free flowing energies of like the Angela Farmer, or like the lightness of Thich Nhat Hanh. It's really interesting how you moved through these different communities, and it sounds like you allowed them each to make an imprint in a certain way, and they've all become kind of part of you and your practice.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the great gifts for me was when I began in 1990 working for Yoga Journal magazine. And what that gave me the capacity to do was pretty much any teacher I wanted to go study with, I could go and study with them, interview them, write about them for the magazine. And so I could explore multiple traditions and kind of go to the source and talk to some of the influential teachers and thought leaders in that tradition, and really begin to integrate and synthesize them into my own embodied experience and really lean into what were the aspects that were most supportive for me at different moments in my practice.
What an amazing opportunity. And I wanted to ask you about your time at Yoga Journal because, hearing you describe it like that, it just makes me realize like yoga and Dharma were not as mainstream, at that time as they are now. And you were really like getting to participate in this like forefront of these practices, coming in and interacting with North American culture and Western culture. And that must have been so fascinating. And I'm just curious, like, what it was like working there at Yoga Journal at the time, because I think like it was so different when I first started practicing yoga and I would pick up that magazine. It was a very different publication than it is now, and how a lot of people see it as, it seems like, kind of more of like a fitness or fashion sort of flavor to it than it wasn't always that way. So I'm just curious to hear a little more about your time there, and what it was like, and some of the things you worked on.
Yes, well, I connected with Yoga Journal. I connected actually first with Stephen Bodian, who was then the editor of Yoga Journal, who had reached out to me because, as part of my studies as an undergraduate, for my senior thesis, I had made a video documentary about the Zen Center of Los Angeles,
Hmm.
which that's another whole story I can tell you another time. But it turned out to be kind of a groundbreaking moment in Zen in America that I happened to be there uh, with a film crew to capture. And so Stephen had reached out to me to review the video for Yoga Journal and talk with me about Yoga Journal and talk with me about the experience of creating that documentary. And so that put Yoga Journal on my radar. And Yoga Journal in those days was a very different magazine, as you say. It was quite small. I think the circulation was maybe 60,000 when I joined. And it was really positioned under the editorship of Stephen Bodian. I really think we viewed it as kind of wanting to be the New Yorker magazine of the spiritual set, to be in-depth explorations of, yes, the yoga tradition, but also all of the related mind, body, spirit modalities that could be supportive for people who were interested in yoga and would also be interested in these complementary systems. So there was a lot of freedom at Yoga Journal. I was working as an editor, but I also wrote for them. And pretty much, as I said, anyone I wanted to go speak with, I could. And so, in addition to writing about yoga and interviewing and speaking to yoga teachers, I wrote a piece about the spirit of creativity. And so, interviewed people like Natalie Goldberg, who was using writing as an awakening path, interviewed somebody who was using music as an awakening path, running a program called Music for the People, improv, drumming, all of these different paths, painting. I went and did an experience called the painting experience, where you were painting in a free form way that could help you wake up. So that was one article I did. I did an article about storytelling as a path. I did an article about drumming, in which among the people I interviewed was Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead. All kinds of other things that you wouldn't think of as strictly yoga was welcome within the embrace of the magazine. And then, of course, there was also the honoring of the yoga tradition. So I got to study and practice with a variety of different teachers. That was where I first connected with Angela Farmer, was writing an article about her and her work. Ganga White and Tracy Rich of the White Lotus Foundation went and did actually one of their teacher trainings and wrote about that, and did an article on Ashtanga yoga and traveled to Maui to meet with some of the early teachers of Ashtanga and when it first began to take root here in the West. So it was really an exciting time for me.
What an amazing experience and front row seat you had to this sort of development of yoga culture and the breadth of that here. I also
Yeah.
remember you talking about in your book, I think, about interviewing BKS Iyengar. And that sounds like quite an assignment because, and he's a controversial figure, complex figure in some ways, known for his like rigor and his ferocity. And it was just a great story in your book about his relationship with meditation and asana, and I just can't imagine being in your shoes sitting down to try and interview him.
Yes, it was quite an experience. And I interviewed him while I was traveling around India. I was actually working on a book which was called From Here to Nirvana, the Yoga Journal Guide to Spiritual India. And so I spent a year or two going back and forth to India, traveling around and visiting different pilgrimage sites, ashrams, yoga centers, Buddhist meditation centers, and really putting together a guidebook for spiritual seekers in India. And as part of that journey is when I interviewed BKS Iyengar. And yes, I remember it was a little like interviewing a thunderstorm. There were big claps of thunder and bolts of lightning and great illumination and showers. It was very exciting. And at several times in the interview, he said to me, "You understand nothing." And then he would
That's
proceed
reassuring.
to enlighten me. Yes, yes. But I do remember one of the things he said, which was so powerful, which is he told me that when he had turned 60, and I think when I was interviewing him, he was about 80. When he had turned 60, his guru, Krishnamacharya, had told him that he should stop practicing asana, the physical aspect of yoga, and he should just focus on the meditation. And he said he tried that for a period of time, maybe a year or so. And he, let's just say, he did not like that. And he
It
felt that
didn't work.
he lost, it didn't work for him. And he went back, he went against the direction of his guru, went back to practicing asana. And what he said to me in that interview was, from now on, even if God himself were to come and tell me to stop practicing asana, I would say, no, I will not do it.
I just love that story. And it's just a perfect story for the conversation we're having about this relationship between embodiment and meditation. And in your practice, you have chosen not to choose between one or the other, or to make it a hierarchy where you graduate from the body practices to the meditation practices. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about why it's been so important to you to practice both, an embodied practice and a meditative practice.
Well, they've both been central to my practice from the beginning. And as you say, I've really never thought of them as separate practices. They've always been for me different dimensions of the same yoga dharma path. They've woven
Mm.
together since the beginning, or almost since the beginning. As I mentioned, when I began, it was really in an academic context. And at that time in my life, although I had been athletic, I'd been a runner, I had never really felt my body from the inside. I was living very much in my head. I was living in the world of ideas and words. I was a writer. I was a journalist. I was working for different newspapers and magazines. And so I really entered through the conceptual. And when I tried to meditate, which I did, of course, I was moving into the Zen tradition, so there was a lot of sitting and stillness and silence. I really had no idea what I was doing. They would say things like follow your breath or watch your breath. I didn't know how to do that. It was as if my breath were somewhere outside of myself and I were looking at it through binoculars from a great distance. I was thinking about my breath. I was thinking about my body. And so, what I found when I discovered the yoga practice while I was living in Santa Fe and had a wonderful teacher who, my roommate was a massage student, and there was a wonderful teacher teaching at the massage school where she was studying massage. And I remember walking into that class, and it was a vinyasa flow style class. And as we moved and breathed, and I pressed back into downward dog and up dog for the first time, I really felt my breath as a living presence. And I felt my heart and my mind moving into and saturating my body, and my
Mm.
body as an expression and manifestation of my heart and my mind and my spirit. And I really felt in the stillness after that practice that I was meditating for the first time. And so, really, from then on, they went together for me. But it was something that I had to put together for myself for the most part, because if I went on a retreat at Plum Village in France with Thich Nhat Hanh, I would be slipping out into the sunflower fields to do a little yoga on my own. There wasn't a guided yoga practice as part of the retreat. Or if I were on a Vipassana retreat up in the mountains at the Lama Foundation, with the wonderful teachers from the Vipassana insight meditation tradition, I would again have to slip out and be on the granite rocks out by my tent in order to do a little yoga. And then in the yoga classes I was going to, you would flow through your practice and it would be beautiful and strong and sweaty and ecstatic. And then maybe there'd be a short shavasana at the end, and then you'd get up and start talking and walk out the door and go back to your car. And so there wasn't the time and space to really let um, to reap the benefits of the practice and to be there in that place where the mind was present and enlivened and energized, and then maybe you could move into the more subtle dimensions. That wasn't available in the places where I was practicing. And so I was really putting them together on my own, as I know many of us were at that time.
And to some degree still, I think it's true, like we have more access to all of those practices, but they're still often learned in separate places, separate locations with different teachers, and yet they come together in this one being. Right? They're not
Exactly.
really separate, but the experience of them can be so separate. They have their own different communities and camps and different takes on things. So that's been a tricky piece, and why I felt so at home in the program you created at Spirit Rock, because it was just like one of the first and only times that it was like 100% the practice that I was doing, like the both and of movement and meditation, like, and we were all doing that. So that was just so refreshing and enriching, wonderful for me.
I'm really glad you found it to be that way. And one of the things I want to name, so it doesn't sound like I think this was something that a few of us just cooked up on our own in some kind of California improvisation, is that yoga and meditation and stillness, the asanas and the pranayama and the stillness practices have always traditionally gone together and woven together. So that if you
Yeah.
look at the 8 limbs of Patanjali's yoga, there's asana and pranayama at the beginning, along with the ethical practices of the yamas and the niyamas. But then you're moving into the meditative practices, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. These are trainings of the heart and mind. And the asanas have always been intended to be in service of the transformation of the heart and mind. And that's how traditionally they were taught. And even as I was in my practice and finding a hard time finding that, I know there were places where that was being done in various ashrams and centers in the yogic tradition, the Hindu yogic tradition, where very much meditation was central to the path and the asanas were embedded in that way. So I just want to really name that and honor that.
Absolutely. And same, like I'm very aware that there are so many beautiful and powerful meditation practices in the yoga tradition. And really, if you study the Yoga Sutras, which is just one text but an important one, it's like a meditation manual. It really is not about asana. But there's also differences between the way that meditation is practiced in the yoga tradition and in the Buddhist tradition. There's philosophical differences between the two traditions, because Buddhism grew out of an earlier yoga tradition, and it's a different branch on the family tree for a reason. So I wonder if you could speak a little to some of the distinctions or differences between the approaches to meditation, or sort of the philosophies that support meditation in both of those traditions, which is a big question, I realize. It's a big assignment.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe I'll just speak from my own experience because I think there are so many beautiful and deep and powerful traditions, and each of them speak to different people at different stages, at different moments, and different times. So I haven't gone as deeply into the meditative aspects of the yogic tradition and the Patanjali yogic tradition. So I really can't speak to that so much. What I can speak to is what I found when I began to encounter, and again, it was early that I began to encounter the the Buddha Dharma and the Buddhist approach to meditation. And the teachers who I was finding were speaking so deeply to me that that's the direction I went. So I don't think it was that I was objectively evaluating the different philosophical dimensions of the different traditions and making a choice. It was just, as I think it is for all of us, a teacher, a path will call, and then that's the one we end up going down. And then we really only know the paths that we've traveled. And so the the Dharma spoke so deeply to my spirit with its foundation in these great truths of impermanence and interconnectedness, interbeing, the truth of the ways that our grasping and clinging and anger and rage can disconnect us from the true source of happiness, and the guidelines it offered toward a life that creates a greater sense of freedom and happiness and ease. All of that spoke to me so deeply that that's the philosophical and meditative path that I began to go down. And I always needed to have my asana practice, my embodied practice, as a way in which I could both support that meditative investigation and also see those truths playing out. I mean, you spend a little time paying attention to your body and you're going to see impermanence. You're going to see interconnectedness. You're going to see this truth that we are not separate from all of life. All of that plays out in the body. And so coming to our bodies through the yogic tools is a way of bringing that forward and using the body as a temple or a laboratory or a meditation hall in which we can realize those things.
That's really beautiful. And I think I feel somewhat similar about being drawn to the Buddhist teachings and the way that they're articulated, and the teachers that I've enjoyed, practicing with over the years. And it is interesting, because we were kind of talking about this sort of different communities around these practices, because sometimes people who are really steeped in the yoga tradition haven't always understood like why I was so drawn to Buddhism as well. I've had two well-known yoga teachers who made comments to me, similar comment that along the lines of, it's a shame when yoga practitioners feel like they have to go over to Buddhism to learn meditation. And I didn't
Mm.
really know what to say, because it wasn't ever like a rejection of the yoga meditations. It was just partly what I had access to, and partly that I just felt so in love with it once I started to study Buddhism.
Yeah, and again, it's such a personal path, and I want to honor and name again. I mean, early in my practice, I mentioned I one of my first asana teachers was Kali Ray, who was definitely incorporating meditative practices into her teaching from the yogic lineage, from her guru. At that time, I was living down in Santa Cruz, and nearby there's the wonderful Mount Madonna Center, where again, asana is completely embedded in the complete yogic path with meditation and devotional practices at the heart of it. And I remember going up to Mount Madonna a few times and practicing with Baba Haridas, who was the guru there, who was a beautiful teacher who was in silence and did all his teachings by writing on a chalkboard. And then, of course, when I traveled around India, I also met many powerful teachers who were introducing and including meditation in their yogic practices. And I also met teachers, I was going from center to center, And so I got a range of different teachers, and there were some teachers in the yoga tradition who were saying, you better not meditate because it will make you go insane. And there were meditation teachers who were saying, you better not do yoga. It will ruin, do yoga asana. It will ruin your yoga practices. So there are traditions in which, lots of different opinions. And that was one of the great lessons for me of writing this book, is just to really see the diversity of paths, and to see that wherever went in each of these ashrams or practice centers, there were people who were going really deep, and they were really transforming, and they were really opening their hearts and minds. And so I really do feel that um, there are so many paths, and so many paths to be deeply honored, and we each end up following the path that uh, serves us the best at the time of life that we're at when we encounter it.
Many doors we can be walking through.
Absolutely.
I wonder how, because a big part of your work has been this integration, this sort of bringing the pieces of these practices together into the same room. I wonder how you would define mindful yoga, which is one term, right, for that integration. And what's the name of the program that you originally started, the training program at Spirit Rock? How would you define mindful yoga, or maybe to get at it in a different way, how would a mindful yoga practice be different from just any ordinary yoga practice you might stumble into in your closest nearest studio?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, mindfulness has become one of these buzzwords. It was not so common 20 years ago. And now the adjective mindful gets put in front of all kinds of things. I've walked through the little town I live in and seen in the window mindful hair products for sale. And I've seen ads for mindful meat, and I've seen ads for the mindfulness camisole. So the word mindfulness can get appended to a lot of things. And so I think when we first began using the word, what we were pointing to was an approach to the embodied practices of yoga, in particular, the asana and the pranayama, that was focused more on the inner experience and of bringing a quality of care and presence to the experience, and of using the poses to support that quality of presence. That it was focused with that in the foreground rather than other dimensions of the practice, like athleticism or getting the pose exactly right or doing more and more advanced postures or looking good in yoga pants or some of these other kinds of more fitness oriented dimensions to the practice. And again, I want to say that there are plenty and were plenty of yoga practitioners who are bringing that quality of care and mindfulness in to the yoga without calling it mindful, because simply because the meditative aspects of yoga do involve that quality of attention and care. And I remember hearing stories, for instance, of people going to study with BKS Iyengar. And one person I talked to had, after the yoga practice, picked up his yoga blanket and kind of tossed it carelessly on top of the pile of yoga blankets in the corner. And that did not go over well with the guru. And Iyengar actually required him for the next week. He was not allowed to do any asana. He needed to simply go and fold the blankets and tend to folding the blankets with a quality of care and presence. So that's absolutely part of the yoga tradition. And I think there is a way of intentionally bringing and centering that quality. That's what we're referring to when we speak of mindful yoga. And the word mindfulness does come initially from the Buddhist tradition.
Mm. Sati.
Sati, exactly. That's right. You've done your homework.
Oh
You
yes,
remember
oh
sati.
yes.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, so
sati.
we studied the Satipatthana Sutta in that program a great deal.
Yes, absolutely. So you know that that word refers to that quality of mindfulness, or sometimes translated as awareness, that quality of presence that can hold and meet all of the contents of our experience. And so mindful yoga is really about supporting and generating, as well as embodying, that quality, that energy of mindfulness that can meet and hold with kindness and without judgment everything that's moving through it.
I think the way part of the way I look at it now is like that mindfulness is there in many yoga classes, but it's often more implicit, and in the way that you teach, it's made explicit. It's centered, right? And I think that
Yes.
can allow us to develop that quality further, or to just take it further, to draw it out more, to explore it more, to bring it into more different aspects of our experience.
Yes, and it can really be a relief because it's a way of, we're still respecting the tools of the asana, and we're respecting these embodied tools, but they're not the goal, right? So, what I've found over my life journey is that in the hard places that inevitably arrive in any life, the precision of alignment in my triangle pose is not what's going to get me through. What's going to get me through is this quality of loving awareness, of being able to rest in something larger and deeper than myself, that can be a resource when moving through hard times. And so a mindful approach to yoga, in a sense, is an approach that's really, again, centering that experience, as you say, and centering those capacities.
That's so beautiful. And I also want to talk about your experience of bringing these embodied practices, yoga practices, into the insight meditation world, the Dharma world. And, you know, having practiced on retreats, it's hard for me to imagine not doing body practices because it's really strenuous to sit. People don't realize to sit in meditation hours and hours a day. It's really tough on the body. So just for that reason alone, doing compassionate practices for the body is very helpful. I think it goes further than that, and it adds more depth and more nuance than just stretching out the muscles that get tight from sitting. But you are really one of a handful of the first yoga teachers here that brought embodied practices, mindful movement practices onto retreats at centers like Spirit Rock, or with Buddhist meditation teachers. So I'd love to hear more about that process and sort of when that started happening. Many of us may think of it as kind of standard now, but I'm really curious about what that was like and when you started doing that.
Yes, and as you say, it wasn't standard back in the beginning. The meditation retreats were meditation retreats, which meant lots of stillness and sitting and walking and sitting and walking. And yoga retreats were yoga retreats with lots of down dog and up dog and handstands and drop backs. And the way it began to come together at Spirit Rock for me is that I was invited by a teacher named Anna Douglas, who was a real pioneer at Spirit Rock. And Anna had created the first yoga and meditation class at Spirit Rock. This was back when Spirit Rock Center had just been founded. There was no retreat center yet. There was just a collection of trailers that made a meditation hall, which was the old community hall.
Was this in the 90s?
This must have been, yes, early 90s,
Okay.
or very early 90s. And Anna had begun teaching this Friday morning class, which was yoga and meditation. And she taught it along with a yoga teacher. And I remember her talking about it and saying that everybody thought this was very odd that she wanted to do this. She had discovered yoga and found it very helpful in her practice, but it wasn't something that was widely done. And so she was teaching with another yoga teacher, Terry Vandiver, who, after some time of teaching the class with Anna, stepped away to do other things. And Anna invited me to come in and teach along with a couple of other yoga teachers. And so that was really when I began, was teaching that class, that Friday class with Anna Douglas. And she would give a talk, and then my role was to take whatever the talk and the meditation teachings that she had offered and kind of on the spot develop a yoga practice or sequence that would support the practitioners in that same teaching. And so if she was teaching on metta and loving kindness, I would be offering practices on metta and loving kindness. If she was teaching on impermanence, I would be pointing to impermanence. If she was teaching on joy, I would be pointing to joy. If it were concentration, I would be doing a more concentrated practice. So that was quite wonderful. And then from there, I began to be invited to teach on some of the very first retreats that were happening at Spirit Rock. And in particular, I was teaching on the women's retreat. And so that was led by Anna, by Deborah Chamberlain Taylor, and Julie Wester. And they were really bringing this vision of the sacred feminine into the practice and really honoring women's lives, women's bodies, women's experience, and also the intuitive and relational dimensions of the practice. So I would be teaching on retreat with them, and those were the elements that would be being really supported in the yoga practice. And I was learning so much. This was a real apprenticeship for me in the Dharma to be teaching on these retreats.
Mm.
So from there, the very first yoga and meditation retreat was born, which was the first retreat to have this fully dedicated integration of practices. And again, Anna Douglas was teaching on that retreat. Mark Coleman was one of the creators of that retreat. And so we began teaching that integrated practice. And in those days, it was Mark and Anna and Howie Cohn. And I was teaching, and also Janice Gates, wonderful, dear friend and Dharma yoga teacher, really began to teach in that integrated way in a retreat context where the yoga and the movement was held as a central piece of the offering, not just something that was off to the side in a different room. On some retreats, it was considered in the old days disrespectful if you did yoga in front of the Buddha. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so that had to be done in a different room. But at the yoga and meditation retreat, it was really in there in the full mix.
Yeah, that was part of what was so striking on our retreats in the MYMT, Mindful Yoga and Meditation Training Program, because I had been on other retreats at Spirit Rock and there was yoga, but it was not done in the Dharma hall or in the main meditation hall. It was done in the upper walking hall. And we were very encouraged to go to the yoga, but it was definitely optional. It wasn't as fully integrated into the retreat in the same way that the guided meditations or the Dharma talk or some of the other activities would have been. And so when we came to this training program and we were setting up to have our yoga mats and our meditation cushions on the floor in the same room in the Dharma hall, that was such a signal to me of like, okay, we're really going to combine this. as full a way as possible.
Yes, and I think that is symbolic, the fact that we never put away the yoga mats. Maybe we rolled them up and or folded them and slid them underneath the zabuton and the zafu, but they were not set away. They were there because they were something that we were coming back to again and again and again. And that really was the vision of that training, that it was a profound integration of these paths.
Did you ever meet with resistance or misunderstanding, or just kind of this isn't what we do here attitudes in the process of bringing yoga into meditation retreats? Or you mentioned, some may have considered it disrespectful to bend and move the body in that way in front of the Buddha statue. Can you say a little more about those negotiations, about how and where, and how this could be combined?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate because I was really bringing it in with the sponsorship of some really wonderful senior teachers. And
Mm-hmm.
so, for instance, in addition to starting teaching with Anna and Mark and Howie on these on the combined retreats, when we started to do the training program, Philip Moffat got involved. And Philip Moffat, again, a senior teacher in that tradition, also a yoga practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
somebody who was very respected within the tradition. And so he really helped move it and, in some sense, insulated me from whatever resistance there might be, because we were really coming in this way, creating something that that was respected because of the teachers from that tradition who were involved in it. And then I was dimly aware, maybe more than dimly aware, that there were other elements and other aspects, as there always are. I mean, nobody can be connected to all traditions, and everybody thinks that the path that they're on is the best. That's just natural. And so there are, I was aware that what we were doing was viewed by some as really being on the fringe. Really, all of the retreats that I was doing at that point, I was teaching on the women's retreat, the creativity retreat, where we brought in painting and writing as part of it, the yoga and meditation retreat, now the yoga and meditation training. And then I began bringing my son on the family retreat. All of these are innovations on the practice that were not part of the traditional monastic
Mm-hmm.
view of the practice. So in a way they were on the fringe, but because I was immersed in them, for me they were the central path. And I really have to give a deep bow to Spirit Rock for supporting this. I mean, they really made room for all of this innovation, and it's really it was a great gift to me, and I think also to those who were drawn to this kind of path, because there are plenty of people for whom these more hybrid practices wouldn't be the right path.
Mm-hmm. And it could be tricky because there's always this tension between tradition and innovation, and we want to honor the traditions and where things come from, and not dilute things, or not distort it to the point where it's no longer recognizable. And so this is just, it's so interesting to hear, from someone like you, this process of how you navigated that and found, the essence of what these teachings are pointing to, and these different ways, these alternative ways sometimes of exploring them or pointing to them.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful. I have always been at the innovative end of the spectrum, and I'm very grateful to those who are more deeply connected to the traditional lineages, because they're keeping something very important alive,
Hmm.
which gives the innovator something to work with. And again, I don't want to break it down into that those people are not innovators, because when you're practicing, everybody is innovating. right? You're bringing it into your own life and heart and body. And that was, I mean, it's innovators everywhere, but those who are holding and diving more deeply into the traditional roots are doing something really, really vital. And I also want to give a nod here to the whole issue of cultural appropriation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because some could say that by taking things out of context and combining and uh, mixing things in this way, that there might be some dishonoring of the traditional roots. And so for me, it's very important to always acknowledge and honor and go back to the traditional roots of these practices and the cultures from which they originate and have been kept alive for so many centuries.
That's something that I think about quite a bit as well, because I know that I've had the good fortune to explore so many different traditions and practices and different movement modalities. And yet I don't want to, yeah, distort or dilute or take them too lightly, without recognizing the incredible intelligence and time and tradition and love that really created these wisdom traditions that we benefit from.
Absolutely.
And so, upcoming, you have a newer program that it seems like it's related to the program we've been talking about, the MYMT. Now you have the DYMT. I'd love to hear more about it. If it's something that's kind of evolved from the prior programs, or what this program will look like.
Yes, I'm really excited about this program, the Dharma Yoga Mindfulness Training, which is a year-long program at Spirit Rock. It is both similar to and different from the old MYMT, Mindfulness Yoga and Meditation training that you did. Uh, One of the wonderful things about this training is that two of the teachers in this training, Rolf Gates and Leslie Booker, who generally goes by Booker, were both graduates of the MYMT. In fact, Rolf did it twice. And then the fourth teacher, Juna Devereaux, is someone who has been integrating yoga and Dharma practices for many, many years and has been deeply connected with Spirit Rock for many years. Juna actually taught a 200-hour teacher training through Spirit Rock called the Dharma Yoga Training, I believe, the DYT, if I'm getting the acronyms correct. And this DYMT began, actually, Juno was the inspiration for beginning this. And we started talking about it years ago. The first plan started to be made actually back before the pandemic. It's probably 6 or 7 years ago that we
Wow.
began talking about it. It initially was going to be a 500-hour training run through Spirit Rock. The pandemic hit, things went online, incarnation after incarnation. And so now the form that it's in now, I think, is going to be really wonderful. It has it's bookended by two residential retreats, 6-night retreats, one at the beginning and one at the end of the program, and then a hybrid retreat in the middle, which is held in the community hall at Spirit Rock, the beautiful new community hall there. And but you don't have to come. You can do it as a commuter there, or you can do it remote from wherever you happen to be. And then there's also a supportive program of practice, meetings with the teachers, and also meetings in small peer groups over the course of the year. So it's really an opportunity to deepen into the integration of these traditions in community.
It sounds wonderful, and the format is a little different, because 10 years ago we would never have thought to have the the hybrid remote option and the retreat option. So now that we're coming out of the pandemic, we have these new formats that are pretty neat to combine together. That who could have foreseen?
Yes, and it's tailored to the different realities of the world now, of the variety of different options that people have. I mean, the old MYMT program was 3 11-day retreats over the course of a year and a half. It's a big commitment
Hmm.
over a long period of time. And also in those days, this was brand new. There was really nowhere else where there was the integration of Dharma and yoga happening. And so now we're in this different world and delivering it in this form. The idea was to really make it more accessible to people and a little easier for people to fit into the time frames of their lives and not have to travel so far to come to 3 retreats.
It was amazing. People came from all over the world for those retreats. I think there were people from Brazil and Norway and the UK and all over the United States and places in South America. I mean, I still keep in touch with some people from that program because we spent so much time together, and much of it was in silence, but it still developed quite a closeness, and it was a really special experience in my path. So I know anyone who's lucky enough to participate in this upcoming program has that to look forward to as well. And um, Booker was one of the teachers in the program already when we did it in my year, and Rolf was participating. That must have been his second go round. As you mentioned, he did it
Yes.
twice, but you just meet amazing people.
Yeah, all these teachers are just fantastic. Juna, Booker, Rolf, powerful teachers, each in their own right, each with their own following. And I'm really excited about being in collaboration with them. I think each of us brings a slightly different flavor, a different set of life experiences, and we've taught together before, and it has been really fantastic. So I'm excited to spend time with this teaching team. And also, I love programs that unfold over time. There is
Hmm.
something so special about either participating in or teaching a program in which you get to come back again and again to the same group of people, deepen in your practice over the course of your lives with so much happening in everyone's life, which can be metabolized through the practice, so much happening in the world, which can be met through the practice, so much transformation held within this structure of an in depth training program. I just love teaching or participating in this kind of journey because it really is a transformational journey. And people often come into a program like this thinking it's going to be about making them a better teacher or something that they can use in that way in their career, and then realize when they get into it, this is about their own journey and all of the side benefits for their teaching career, for instance, come out of that inner transformation.
I'm sure that it will make them a better teacher. It made me a stronger teacher, but I so appreciated how the style of teaching in our program, it was deeply experiential. It was not about PowerPoints and slides and manuals and information. It was about taking a really deep dive. And there was information. There were Dharma talks. There was, there were these guideposts along the way, and there were themes, and there was study. But it was so much more about just taking it in, just really experiencing it, and trusting that the teaching would be an extension of our practice.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really the essence of it, that as a teacher, your best teaching does arise from your own practice. And that's something that grows in this experiential container. And that's why I love teaching in the context of silent retreat, because there's kind of an alchemical vessel that you've created in which your being becomes so sensitized that the teachings drop in and take root at a different level. And I'm reminded of something I heard Thich Nhat Hanh say when I was on retreat with him in Plum Village back in the early 90s. And we'd all come into the Dharma hall, everybody would have their notebooks and they'd be writing down everything they wanted to remember. And I remember at one point he asked us to stop. He said, put away the notebooks. And he said, don't try to catch the Dharma rain in a bucket. Just let it fall on you. The seeds are within you. Let the rain fall on you and the seeds will sprout.
No one can put it into words quite like Thich Nhat Hanh. What a
That's right.
teaching.
Yeah.
Well, I'm aware of the time, and I feel like I could, pick your brain and listen to you speak for hours, but I'm sure you have more to get to in your day. So, could we close by you just giving us information about where people can find your work or your books or more about the DYMT program?
Absolutely. So you can go to my website, which is annecushman.com. That's ANNECUSHMAN. And you'll find my teaching calendar there. And for more information about the DYMT, it is, of course, listed on my teaching calendar, but you can also go direct to Spirit Rock's website, spiritrock.org, and look up the DYMT, and it will give you all the information and the registration process for that on the Spirit Rock website. And that is coming up soon. I just want to say that that is beginning the last day in May. So if you are interested, if this is sounding exciting to you, don't wait.
Don't delay.
Yes. Walk mindfully to your computer and explore a little further.
I love it. Yes, thank you. So I'll make sure to put links to all of those things on the show notes so people can easily find them. And yes, again, just thank you so much, Anne, for taking the time today to share so much of your wisdom. It's been a real delight to speak with you here.
Thank you, Addie. It's been a pleasure for me as well, and I appreciate the good work you're doing in the world.
Thank you. And I appreciate your long track record of paving the way for people like me who do want to have this kind of practice and do this kind of work. So I just have immense gratitude to you.
Thank you so much.
So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.